Hexagram 6, the one known as conflict.
Yeah, Hexagram 6, it definitely brings to mind those big external battles, like lawsuits, arguments, all that. But it also really reflects our own inner struggles, which is interesting.
So it's not just about what's happening out there, it's about that conflict within us, too.
Hmm.
That's what I find so fascinating about the source material we're looking at for this deep dive. It connects Hexagram 6 to these three different levels of consciousness. Have you ever felt like, even when you're doing things that seem good, you still have this, I don't know, underlying sense of unease?
Oh, I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling. And the source suggests it might be because we're operating from what it calls level 1 consciousness, prioritizing personal happiness, or PPH. At level 1, we're driven by this need to always feel good, to avoid any kind of discomfort. And then level 3, that's the real transformative stage, wishing happiness for others, or WHO. It's about truly wanting others to be well, with, like, no strings attached.
That sounds pretty idealistic, to be
hmm
honest. How do we even begin to shift from, being so focused on our own happiness to actually wishing happiness for others? That seems like a huge leap.
Well, the source actually dives into this fascinating practice that acts as a kind of bridge between these levels. And it's all about breath work, not just like calming the nervous system. That's
Yeah.
part of it. Each inhale and exhale is actually connected to a quality that helps us embody those higher levels of consciousness.
Okay, I'm picturing like some deep meditative breathing here.
Hey,
I'm curious, how does this actually work? Paint us a picture.
imagine this. Each inhale is like the wind of humility, sweeping away your ego and any preconceived notions. Then the exhale, that's carried by the river of loving intent, allowing you to approach things with genuine care and compassion. Then there's the thunder of the present moment grounding you in the here and now, followed by the mountain of compassion representing that unwavering support. And then the fire of clarity burning away all that delusion. Each breath cycle ends with the lake of tranquility where, everything settles and finds stillness. And the whole practice is supported by earth and sky, reminding us of our interconnectedness with everything.
That is some seriously powerful imagery. I can almost feel myself shifting into a different state just listening to you describe it. So this breathwork helps us move away from that very self-focused level 1 energy.
Exactly. It helps us become what the source calls the impartial witness, or you can also think of it as the ideal parental figure. Imagine the wisest, most compassionate version of yourself. That's who you're cultivating through this practice.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But this is where it gets a little, well, paradoxical, right? Because the source also talks about the need for both power, vulnerability. How do those two things work together when we're trying to navigate conflict? They seem kind of opposite.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting insights here. It's not about being passive or just going with the flow. There are absolutely times you need that real inner strength, that power, to just say, we're not doing that right now, to those negative thoughts, those CRS and gag behaviors that keep popping up.
So we're setting boundaries, taking a stand for ourselves. Makes sense.
Right. But then right after that assertion of power, you got to soften. Got to be willing to embrace vulnerability, not weakness, but that willingness to acknowledge those difficult thoughts and emotions without judging them.
Interesting. It's like a dance between firmness and gentleness.
Exactly. It's about embodying both sides of that paradox. And that's what lets you truly transcend the conflict. It's not a battle between opposing forces anymore, but a dance between different parts of yourself.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still trying to figure out how this all ties back to Hexagram 6. We started with conflict. Now we're talking about breathwork and vulnerability. Help me connect those dots.
That's a great question. When we're coming from that place, prioritizing personal happiness, we tend to get all defensive, anxious, controlling. Or we cling to a specific outcome, thinking that's the only way we'll find peace.
It's so true. It's like, if I can just win this argument, or if I can just get this person to see it my way, then I'll finally be happy. But honestly, how often does that actually work?
Exactly. And that's what's so insightful about Hexagram 6. It's not saying avoid conflict, like run from it. It's more like, I don't know, an invitation to approach conflict from a totally different level of consciousness.
So instead of just reacting from that CRPIP gag place, we can actually use that breath work to shift into the role of the impartial witness, to see things more clearly, less from that me versus them perspective.
Yes, exactly. Think about it. Hexagram 6 represents conflict, obviously, but it also holds the seeds of resolution within it. By practicing that breathwork, bringing in the wind of humility, the river of loving intent, the thunder of the present moment, all those qualities, we're essentially changing our inner landscape, creating space for something new.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all works, but let's get practical for a second. Say I'm in the middle of a heated argument, with a coworker or a family member, whatever. How do I actually use the breath work in that moment?
Well, first of all, it's huge that you're even aware of those reactions in the first place. That's the impartial witness starting to do its thing. You're not just blindly reacting, you're actually observing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm still feeling all that CRP. What do I do with it?
That's when you take a pause. Not like a dramatic storm-off pause, an internal pause. Even just a few breaths can make a difference. Remember, inhale, wind of humility. Exhale, carried by the river of loving intent. When you do this, you're moving your energy away from that fight or flight mode, calming the storm inside.
It's like hitting the pause button on that argument that's happening in my head. I can see that. But then what? How do I actually deal with the conflict itself?
Well, from that calmer, more centered place, you can start to respond differently. Less reactive, more in line with what you actually believe in. You might even find the whole conflict starts to soften as you soften.
So it's not about ignoring the issue or pretending everything is fine. It's about changing how I approach the issue.
Exactly. And remember that paradox we were talking about, needing both power and vulnerability. That comes into play here too. You might need that inner strength, that power to say, we're not doing this right now, I need a minute. But then you combine that with vulnerability, not weakness, but that willingness to say, hey, I hear you. I see where you're coming from. Let's figure out a way forward together.
So it's about finding that balance between standing my ground and being open to understanding the other person. That's powerful. But the source adds another layer to this whole thing, right? It says that even the so-called positive outcomes, like winning that argument, getting your way, can still be rooted in that desire for personal happiness, which ultimately keeps us stuck.
That's such a crucial point. Even when we get what we think we want, if it's all ego-driven, it's not true peace.
It's not about the outcome itself, but the energy behind it. That's huge.
It really is. And that's why the source emphasizes moving beyond level one,
Yeah.
beyond prioritizing personal happiness. It's about cultivating a real desire to wish happiness for others. That's where the fulfillment is.
This is a lot to process, but it's really helpful. We've covered so much, from those CRP and gag behaviors to the breath work, the paradox of power and vulnerability, and now this whole idea that even winning can be a trap if we're not careful.
And remember, it all circles back to Hexagram 6, that image of conflict. It's not something to be afraid of. It's actually an opportunity to grow, a doorway to those higher levels of consciousness.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. It's like we've been handed this amazing toolkit for, dealing with conflict in a whole new way.
Oh,
but I gotta admit, it can feel kind of overwhelming. Where do we even start putting all this into practice?
That's a good question. And I think, well, the beauty of this approach is that it's a practice. It's not about being perfect. Remember those 3 levels of consciousness we talked about? Most of us, we spend a lot of time at level 1, right? Prioritizing personal happiness. And that's okay. It's a natural starting point. That's when we start to see how they're actually the things keeping us stuck in that conflict cycle.
It's like, shining a light on those patterns that we've been running on autopilot without even realizing it.
Exactly. And that awareness, well, that's the first step, right? Then as we start playing around with the breath work, we start cultivating those level 2 qualities. The equanimity, the peace, that ability to just observe our thoughts and emotions without getting completely swept away by them.
So it's like we're training our minds to respond differently, creating a little space between like the trigger and the reaction.
Yeah, that's it. And from that space, that's where we can make different choices. Choices that are more aligned with, our values, with our deepest desires for ourselves and for the world.
So it's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot. It's about developing a different type of intelligence, a wisdom that comes from like understanding ourselves better and responding to challenges with more, skill and compassion.
I like that. And as we cultivate that inner peace, that wisdom, well, it naturally starts to ripple outwards. It affects our relationships, how we interact with the world.
That's what's so exciting about this whole thing.
Yeah.
It's not just about personal transformation. It's about creating a more peaceful, harmonious world.
Absolutely. And it all starts with us,
Yeah.
Each of us making those tiny shifts in our own consciousness, in our own way of being.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hexagram 6 and the 3 levels of consciousness, I want to leave our listeners with a question. What if conflict, instead of being something we fear and avoid, could actually be a catalyst? like a catalyst for our own growth and evolution.
What if by embracing that paradox of power and vulnerability, by doing the breath work, by choosing to operate from a place of, wishing happiness for others, we could actually turn conflict into a path to true peace and fulfillment.
It's a pretty powerful invitation, and it starts with that very first breath, that first conscious choice to show up differently. So we encourage you, take what resonates with you from this deep dive and just start experimenting. See how these concepts can help you navigate those inevitable conflicts, the ones we all face, with more grace, wisdom, and compassion.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, keep diving deep.
See you next time.